So about 6 o'clock last night, I drew the short stick that I got to talk about nitrogen cycling today. Fortunately, my PhD is in nitrogen cycling, so I had a lot of this information. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to figure out exactly what I wanted to say, so we're going to go on a fun journey as I fly by the seat of my pants here. So residue decomposition and nitrogen cycling, where all of this starts is really once that residue gets put on the soil. Now, nitrogen cycling in a whole is incredibly complex. People have spent careers looking at simply what's happening within the soil. And we just don't have time to go into that detail today, but there's some really important topics that can help you understand at a functional level what's going on in your soil when it comes to nitrogen cycling. So starting, like I said, with decomposition, at the most basic level is the chemical breakdown of materials into simpler compounds. And all of this happens through microbial metabolism. Now, of course, there are physical breakdowns of that organic matter as well, but most importantly, it's all happening through microbial metabolism. And this process of decomposition and release of nutrients into the soil environment is mineralization. So there's two different groups of minerals that we're going to be talking about today, and they can get a little hairy in their explanation. So you have your organic nutrients. Now, we have to throw out the idea of organic farming and that kind of chemical idea and look at it basically, organic is something that was or is alive. So crop residues, root exudates, ground squirrel carcass are all organic forms of nitrogen. And when you go through that mineralization process, it turns into inorganic forms of nitrogen. So your ammonium, nitrate, nitrite, and this also applies to all of your other nutrients in the soil. Generally, if it can be taken up by the plant, it's an inorganic form of whatever nutrient you're talking about. So why do microbes go through this decomposition process? What are they getting out of it? Why does it happen in our environment? And really it comes down to they need the carbon that's within that biomass to build their own biomass, to make their bodies. It's the exact same reason that we eat food to build our bodies. Microbes need that carbon. They also use that carbon to make metabolites, so things that are released into the soil. You think about the glomalin that's produced by mycorrhizal fungi. That's a form of metabolite exudate that is really important for our soil that they're making as a result of their metabolisms. And then also produce energy. Again, just like we eat food to have energy, they need to do the same thing. And this process of using carbon to produce energy is respiration. So when you think of respiration, there's certain tests in the soil that we use. Does anybody know a name of a soil respiration test that's pretty popular? CO2 burst. Yep, CO2 burst, Slavita test. So essentially what you're measuring is how active those microbes in the soil are breaking down organic matter, breaking down carbon, and then releasing that back into the atmosphere. Now, the reason that we're seeing that CO2 being released from the soil is microbes aren't incredibly efficient when it comes to using that carbon that they're consuming. So anywhere from 20 to 60% of the carbon that they're eating is being released back into the atmosphere as CO2. So if you look at this graph, here at time 0, time naught, when we add those fresh residues, there's a significant amount of it on the soil or in the soil. And then as the microbial biomass increases really quickly, there's a lot of food for them to eat. It goes up and then slowly starts decreasing as the amount of organic matter or organic material in the soil decreases as well. And eventually we get to the point where everything's been decomposed, microbial activity is fairly low, and now you're left with stable carbon within the soil. In systems like Gabe was talking about, where we have a living cover all the year long, there's continually organic material being added, we're not going to hit this slump permanently. Okay, this would be you combine your corn, whatever it is, and then you just leave it throughout the year without adding any other kind of organic material to it. And over the long term, this would cause depletion of the soil organic material, which we'd obviously like to get away from.
And if I may, Brady, and that's what we're seeing worldwide. I made the comment yesterday, I've been on thousands of farms and I've never been on one, including my own, that's not degraded. We're all degraded. As good as Joe's is here, At one time, it was virgin prairie that had more carbon in it, and it was cycling. It didn't keep decreasing, okay? So that's why when I showed those scenarios of cropping systems, it's to collect as much solar energy, i.e. carbon, as we can to put into the system, to fuel the system longer term.
Mm-hmm. Right, because if you're not adding that fuel to the system, eventually they're going to start breaking down our stabilized organic matter, and you're going to be left with, organic matters of 1% or less if you allow that to happen. The microbes are like little livestock. They need to eat something, and they're going to get it one way or another.
Yeah, I just read a soil test 2 days ago with a 0.2 organic matter. That's getting pretty low.
So on average, most soils have that carbon use efficiency of about 30%. So what that means is for every 10 units of carbon, 10 widgets of carbon, however you want to measure it, the microbes are able to digest and return to the soil about 3 of those. The rest of it is going to come off as respiration. So here's a really nice graphic that was made up by Kaylee Gash, a former professor at NDSU, that really shows how, as residue is decomposed, the mass of organic matter, of organic material really decreases. Every step of the process, CO2 is being released, and this isn't something that just happens over one growing season. In order to make organic matter in the soil, it can be up to decades before it finally reaches that fully stabilized point, something that's going to reside in the soil long term. So in order for this cycle to keep going in a very healthy way, again, we need to continually be adding these materials back to the soil so that it can happen. So another intricacy to this entire process is I've been talking about carbon this whole time. Well, that's only one part of this entire equation. For microbes to fully digest that carbon, they need other nutrients. Most notably are nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, if these nutrients aren't available in the organic matter itself, those microbes have to get it from somewhere else. So there's free nitrogen and phosphorus floating around in the soil solution, and they're going to suck those up in order to use it to break down that carbon. So this process of microbes taking up the nutrients that would be available to plants also, bringing it into their own biomass is considered a mobilization. So it was available in the soil, the plants could have gotten it, but the microbes got at it first. It's immobilized, no longer available to the plant. And all of this relates back to a carbon to nitrogen ratio. So everything in nature is generally in balance, and the exact same thing is happening with microbes. So on average, in a bacterial cell in its body, there are 5 units of carbon and 1 unit of nitrogen. Now this increases as the complication of that particular organism goes up. So for example, fungi are about 25 units of carbon to 1 unit of nitrogen. So on average, we can figure microbial biomass is around 10 to 1. 10 units of carbon, 1 unit of nitrogen. Now, you've all heard of like CNN ratios of biomass, how quickly it's going to break down, what's going to come available when, and that's all related to how those microbes are going to be able to digest that material. So sawdust, for example, and there's a good video that I'm going to show right after this. Sawdust, where you have 400 units of carbon to 1 unit of nitrogen, any particular microbe that's in the soil is not going to be able to consume a unit of that because they're not going to get the nitrogen nutrients that they need in order to break it down. Whereas you have a compost, 15 to 1, well, that's pretty close. They're not going to have to take up a lot of nitrogen in addition to what's in that biomass already. So we can consider the break point at approximately 25 to 1. Anything with a higher CN ratio to that is going to have to tie up a significant amount of nitrogen in order to break that down. Below that, you were not going to see a lot of nitrogen tie up. Now, it's important to talk about this tie up isn't permanent. Okay, eventually those microbes have to die. And when they die, then their body biomass is available to other microbes for them to eat. Eventually, this nitrogen can be released back into the soil environment, providing that you have this healthy system going. So I'll stop talking for a little bit. Again, this is from Kaylee Gash. It shows a really good explanation of how CN ratio works. and when you can expect nitrogen tie-up to happen and when you can expect nitrogen release. I encourage you to look up the entire video. It's about 14 minutes long. I'm just going to show a quick part of it.
Hi, I'm Kaylee Gash, Assistant Professor of Soil Health at North Dakota State University. I've got a little demonstration for you that illustrates how residue chemistry, specifically the carbon and nitrogen ratio of different types of residue, influences decomposition, and explain the decomposition process and why that carbon to nitrogen ratio matters and how it relates to decomposition speed. So you've probably heard of people talk about the carbon to nitrogen ratio of different types of residue. That just refers to the relative amount of carbon molecules inside of a substance relative to the amount of nitrogen. And so a higher ratio would indicate less nitrogen-rich material, whereas a lower ratio or a narrower ratio means that there's more nitrogen relative to the carbon. So if we think about two different types of residue, here we have wheat straw, which has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 80 to 1, so 80 units of carbon to 1 unit of nitrogen. We know that this is a very high carbon-rich type of material. And we'll compare that to straw that's from young alfalfa residue. And that has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 13 to 1, so 13 units of carbon for each single unit of nitrogen. So we know that the nitrogen fixing species, which has higher protein content and higher nitrogen content in its tissues, will have a narrower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So for the purposes of the demonstration, we're going to use Skittles to represent the carbon and nitrogen molecules in different substances. So the purple Skittles are going to represent carbon and the green Skittles are going to represent nitrogen. And so if we're interested in breaking down a type of residue, we can imagine that it has a set ratio. So this residue is representing a substance that has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 10 to 1. This would be something similar to that alfalfa straw that we were just looking at. So you can see a lot of carbon relative to nitrogen. And if we want to decompose this, then we need to have microbes break it down. And as they do that, they're going to consume some of the carbon and nitrogen and use it to build more microbial cells. But they're also going to use some of that material for metabolism, which requires that they respire CO2 up into the atmosphere. Our microbial cells have a very rigid ratio of 5 to 1, and they have pretty strict nutritional needs. The amount of carbon that is going to make its way into the CO2 pool relates to a microbe's carbon use efficiency, or CUE. And we're going to estimate a carbon use efficiency for this microbe to be 50%, which means that for every carbon that goes into making a new microbial cell, another carbon is going to go up into the atmosphere as CO2. So in this example, since we're trying to build more microbial cells with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 5 to 1, and considering that 50% carbon use efficiency, we'll demonstrate how these microbes break down this residue. So to build a new microbial cell, we need 5 units of carbon, 1 unit of nitrogen, and then remember, just as much carbon is going to go up into the atmosphere as CO2. We've successfully broken through this residue. We have nothing left. We have no excess carbon and we have no excess nitrogen, which means that for the requirements that we set up, carbon to nitrogen ratio demands of the microbial community as 5 to 1 and that 50% carbon use efficiency, we have completely decomposed the entire pool of residue with no excess nitrogen, no excess carbon. Now, if we look at a different type of residue, maybe something with a much higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, we can see there's much less nitrogen available. So if we, again, try to decompose this material, given these metabolic demands, we end up having an excess of carbon, even though some of the carbon is still making its way up into the atmosphere. So this would be an instance where we have a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio relative to the metabolic needs of the microbial community. And the only way then to break through all of this carbon material is to supplement it with nitrogen. And so these microbes could be scavenging nitrogen from nearby sources, maybe from the soil solution or from available fertilizer in the soil. And they would be then immobilizing that nitrogen so that they could build more biomass using this carbon. And at the same time, they'll be respiring carbon up into the atmosphere. Now, a really low carbon to nitrogen material will give us a different result. So here we have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 2:1. This is such a low or narrow carbon to nitrogen ratio that we don't actually even see this carbon to nitrogen ratio in plant materials or even animal tissues. So again, thinking about the demands of our microbe and wanting to build more microbial cells, we'll go ahead and stick to the same rules that we've been following in making new microbial cells. So we've burned through all of that residue and we have a lot of nitrogen left. So this would be an instance where nitrogen would be released out into the environment. This is a mineralization process. So now this nitrogen can't be used unless we supplement this system with carbon.
So as you can see, it's a pretty rigid process in how all of this breaks down. And that's why the idea of CN ratios to measure the quality of residues works really well. Like I said, I encourage you to watch the rest of that video. She has some really good things to say from there on out. On both sides of that process, you can have a tie-up of carbon in the material that's not going to be able to be broken down without adding supplemental nitrogen. And on the other side of that spectrum, if you have something that may be too high in nitrogen, and like she said in there, it's not all that common that you're going to run into that in nature, but the microbes wouldn't break down that that nitrogen-rich material either because they don't have anything to meet their carbon requirements, or they would have to mine carbon out of the soil in order for that to happen.
Go ahead. Exactly. So think of this scenario as there, how this carbon-nitrogen ratio works. We often hear producers, well, I have to till because my soils are cold. I have too much residue. Well, they don't have a residue issue. They got a carbon-nitrogen ratio imbalance. And they're not cycling through that residue to the point where they can get the crop in the desired time frame. Okay? So to offset that, you tweak your crop rotation, to balance your carbon-nitrogen ratio so it'll cycle through at the appropriate time. And Joe talked about that a lot in the field, how important it was for him to have the residue there that would last so he doesn't have the bare soil. Okay? So you balance, you determine your crop rotation so you can cycle through, as Brady just showed us, cycle that residue through in the appropriate time frame while leaving enough armor to protect that soil. So these people who say, oh, I have to till because my soils are cold, I have too much residue. No, the problem is in your crop rotation. That's the issue.
The microbes aren't functioning at a level that they could just break that stuff down themselves.
Yep. And as Grant talked about yesterday in their system, the residue, now he has a challenge keeping enough residue because the system is so alive.
In systems where you see that breakdown incredibly fast, you know that there's a high amount of nitrogen and phosphorus available to those microbes in the system so that they have no problem consuming large amounts of carbon because they have everything else available to them.
The way to step out of it is to diversify that rotation, making sure that early on, as you move into that path, down this regenerative path, you're going to use a crop rotation that has a bit more legumes in it in order So it's a lower C to N ratio and it'll cycle through faster, okay? You look at more advanced systems, Grant's or mine, we don't put a whole lot of legumes in the system because otherwise we won't have any residue left, okay? We're using more higher carbon crops. So you change your crop rotation a bit. Abby, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I could add is that oftentimes within a plant, the C to N ratio is different for the above ground biomass versus the roots. And so the microbes, the roots are generally more rich in nitrogen, and so the microbes are going to work on that first. The higher quality material will leave the residue on the surface. So I think it's just important to kind of, not really for management or whatever, but just to know that you are oftentimes below ground giving them a little bit higher quality material than you are above ground, which is probably good if you want to keep some of that residue on the surface to protect that soil.
If I may add one more thing. Oftentimes we see people, well, I got to till, my soils are so compacted. Oftentimes that comes about because of excess nitrogen use and excess nitrogen in the system. Because the biology is consuming all the glues, it's consumed all the residues in that. There's so much nitrogen available, and I'll show you a soil test that has excess nitrogen. It's consumed, as Abbey said, the organic material in the roots. It consumes the above ground biomass. Then it starts eating the glues that holds the soil aggregates together. And pretty soon your soil becomes just like a brick. We often see this in systems where people plant soybeans on soybeans or straight alfalfa. Straight alfalfa in a rotation is extremely hard on the soil. Some of the most collapsed soils we ever see are in straight legume systems because that is simply not enough carbon to feed the system and your soils are going to collapse. Biology will take it there.
Right, yeah, so if there's an excess nitrogen, they're going to find every source of carbon they can within that soil.
Right. This is why it's exactly wrong of people to think we need to remove animals from the system. What'll happen is that will oxidize away and it'll start desertifying. You know, that's how our deserts were formed often, is that they were either overgrazed or you see the same thing with undergrazing. Like in 20-year CRP that's never been hayed or grazed, that's what you have. And your plants start getting thinner and thinner and there's not enough nitrogen in the system.
So all of this can be kind of summed up in an incredibly oversimplified nitrogen cycle. So earlier I talked about like the two pools of nitrogen, your organic N and your inorganic N. So obviously we're adding the residue as organic nitrogen. It's broken down by the microbes into microbial biomass. Now for that to become plant available, there's kind of a flux happening here where, I just realized my arrows are backwards. The microbes will die off. What was in their bodies will become available to the plants through mineralization, pretend that's the other way. And then again, if you add whatever amount of carbon-rich material back to the soil, those microbes will have to scavenge that organic nitrogen if it's not available in the matter to bring it into their microbial biomass. So in healthy systems, this is happening back and forth fairly consistently. If you get in a system that's out of balance, then it's going to favor one side or the other, which, as Gabe had just talked about, there's ramifications both directions. Now, where the other complications kind of come into the nitrogen cycle, and I'm just going to glaze over this quickly, are the other ways that nitrogen are leaving our system. So the goal would be having it take up through plant uptake, and then eventually some of that would be available again as plant residue. The other aspect of that is nitrogen loss into the environment through volatilization or leaching or any of that sort. And again, that's something we want to minimize because once that's gone, it's gone.
Remember out at Joe's soil, I was holding what we call those macro aggregates that are not as prone to wind erosion, water erosion. You know, that's what we want to see in a soil. In agriculture, we focus so much on yield and production, we think we need all this nitrogen. But how many of your agronomists talk to you about carbon? You know, we need to focus on carbon. You know, there's 32,000 tons approximately of atmospheric nitrogen above every surface acre of Earth. We got plenty of nitrogen, okay? Now we we have to, it's up to us through our crop rotation, and through focusing on soil health principles to have the biology, the rhizobia that can take that atmospheric nitrogen, make it available. But very few people are focusing on the carbon aspect. And that's critical to know just what Brady talked about there. There's carbon, nitrogen. And soil is approximately 11 parts carbon, 1 part nitrogen, approximately, right? Yeah, and yet we're putting copious amounts of nitrogen on, and then we wonder why our soils collapse in that, right?
The best analogy I've heard on this, when it comes to feeding your soil and feeding your soil microbes, carbon are like the vegetables that you and I need to stay alive, to stay healthy. Nitrogen is the candy, okay? So as a kid, if you eat all your vegetables, then you can have that one piece of candy and you're still gonna be healthy. Whereas, okay, here's an entire bucket of candy, you can have that if you eat, one piece of broccoli. That's not necessarily gonna work out.
I'd use the scenario with meat instead of vegetables.
Right.
But that's beside the point. And not fish, Joe, not fish. But you have to have diversity of plant species to have diversity of soil microbiology. That's why one of the soil tests we use with our clients is a PLFA, phospholipid fatty acid test, to determine, give us an indication how many bacteria, how many protozoa, how many fungi, and then, those protozoa and nematodes, they're the predators that feed on the bacteria. And they're missing, well, not totally missing, but they're very low numbers in most of our cropland fields because of a lack of diversity. So, excuse me, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, so getting back to the scenario we're working on here on the whiteboard, as far as where to start, that's why I showed. You start by, let's collect more solar energy, let's get diversity, some diversity into the cropping system, and that's the one, quite frankly, that most farmers shun at. You get into the I states, and corn beans, then they wonder why they have such high input costs. Their cost of production are so high. They may be yielding more, but their return, net profit, is not that great. The other thing is, as it's not only the greatest economic return, but you are challenging your system more so it becomes more efficient. You're going to have an increase in azotobacter and other free-living bacteria that can take that atmospheric nitrogen and help convert it into usable forms for the plants. We have to, it's like an athlete in training. You can't just keep dumping the same amount of fertility onto a crop year after year after year and expect your soil to become healthy, right? Can't do it that way. You have to methodically challenge that. That's why we really encourage the check strips. But this all gets back to how we started today. Where do you start? That's where you start. It's diversification, the principles to drive the processes. Oftentimes it means an expansion of crop rotation. It certainly involves collecting more solar energy over a greater period of time. And for crop producers, we talked about a little bit about it yesterday. Grow your own cover crop seed, what you can. Grant's back there nodding his head. I know Grant's like me. We'll harvest our own cover crop seed and it's ready in the bin at all times. There's no excuse to not, seed it. Do I ever clean my cover crop seed? We just run it through a quick cleaner to take the chaff out and those small seeds, anybody know what green foxtail pigeon grass seed is for crude protein? 27%. That's perfect poultry ration right there. The way to make money, take the waste stream from one enterprise to fuel the profit in another. That's how you really make money farming. Yeah. Yeah, when I see the neighbors out there planting corn into snow, last I checked,